Tully Monster. The Tully Monster is a creature that's so mysterious and alien-looking that to this day, after over 60 years of studies by some of the best paleontologists in the world, there is still no agreement on what it actually is. It was discovered in 1955 by Francis Tully, an amateur fossil hunter digging through deposits in Illinois. He brought what he found to the Field Museum in Chicago, and the scientists there could not place it in any known category of animal. They were not sure if it was a vertebrate or an invertebrate, not sure what group it belonged to, not sure how it was related to anything else alive at the time. We know that it lived about 307 million years ago, and that its body was soft and elongated with a tail fin at one end. At the other end was a long, flexible snout with a small, claw-like mouth tipped with teeth. Most strangely, its eyes sat on rigid stalks extending from the sides of its body, pointing outward in a way that resembles nothing alive today. It was such a weird case that Illinois made it their official state fossil in 1989. What it ate, how it moved, and where it fits in the history of life on Earth remain genuinely open questions. Gigantopithecus. The story of how this creature was discovered is pretty peculiar. It wasn't discovered at a dig site. It was found in a shop. In 1935, a paleontologist was browsing an apothecary shop in Hong Kong, where fossilized bones and teeth were commonly sold as dragon teeth for use in traditional medicine. Among the items for sale, he found a single molar that was unmistakably from a primate and unbelievably huge. He bought it, studied it, and came to a shocking conclusion. It came from an ape significantly larger than any known species. Then, in the decades, researchers have found additional specimens across southern China and Southeast Asia. However, the total collection amounts to a handful of jawbones and around 2,000 isolated teeth. That is everything we have. We have no skull, no limb bones, and no spine. Here comes the crazy part though. Current estimates suggest it stood around 10 feet tall and weighed up to 660 pounds. This would make it the largest ape ever known to have existed. It likely moved on all fours like modern gorillas rather than walking upright. Also, the Gigantopithecus survived until roughly 250,000 to 300,000 years ago, a period when Homo erectus, one of early human species, was present in the same region. The two almost certainly met. A 2024 study identified the most likely cause of its extinction as climate shifts that eliminated the fruit sources it depended on. Kelenken. In 1999 in Argentina, an amateur fossil hunter named Guillermo Aguirre found something incredible, the largest bird skull ever, living or extinct. If you saw the shoebill stork before and thought it was terrifying, you won't like this one. After examination, they found out what it was, a specimen of Kelenken, a terror bird, part of a family of large flightless predators that dominated South America for millions of years. It lived roughly 15 million years ago and stood around 10 feet tall, making it the largest terror bird ever discovered. If its sheer size wasn't scary enough, it could run somewhere around 37 miles per hour, just like a modern car. It almost certainly could not swallow large prey whole. Instead, researchers believe it ran prey down at high speed, then used its beak like a hatchet, striking downward repeatedly, or grabbing smaller animals and shaking or slamming them against the ground. Once something was in its range, outrunning it would have been difficult for most animals alive at the time. South America was an isolated continent for much of this period, which is part of why terror birds were able to thrive with so little competition. When North and South America eventually connected, new predators came south, ecosystems changed, and the Kelenken disappeared. Helicoprion. In the 1890s, in Russia, deep in the Ural Mountains, a researcher found something unlike anything they had seen before. He saw a tight spiral of teeth, perfectly preserved, almost like a circular saw blade made of bone. The problem was that there was no jaw around it, no skull, no body, just the spiral. He immediately sent the fossils to a famous Russian geologist, who noticed that it didn't fit any known animal category. He decided to name it Helicoprion, but there was a question that scientists couldn't answer for the next 100 years. Where on earth did a circular saw blade fit on a fish? They came up with many hilarious theories, but it wasn't until 1950 that the mystery had a turn. In a phosphate mine in Idaho, they found one that remarkably preserved a few bits of jaw cartilage alongside the teeth. Then, the mystery was finally solved very recently, just in 2013, when scientists finally put that Idaho specimen into a high-powered CT scanner. The digital reconstruction revealed something insane. The spiral didn't stick out of the nose or tail. It was entirely enclosed within the lower jaw, acting like a biological meat slicer right inside the mouth. When it bit down on something, the spiral rotated, pulling prey inward and slicing it as it went. If that's not disturbing enough, its largest recognized specimens reached up to roughly 25 to 32 feet long. Another weird thing is that when it grew, its old teeth did not fall out. They just kept spiraling inward, tightly wound, preserved inside the jaw forever. Every tooth it ever grew from when it was born was still there at the moment it died. It went extinct during the Permian-Triassic extinction event, the largest mass extinction in Earth's history, which wiped out about 90% of all marine species. Arthropleura. Imagine something as big as a car, covered in armored plates, with dozens of legs, moving steadily toward you. That's what you would have seen if Arthropleura, the giant millipede, existed today. It was up to 8 feet long and 1.5 feet wide, and it's the largest land invertebrate we have ever found evidence of. It lived around 300 million years ago, leaving behind fossilized footprints over 20 inches wide. These massive trackways are so big that if you stumbled across them today, you'd mistake them for ATV tire tracks. Also, for 170 years after its discovery, this creature had a mystery: its head. Because most fossils were actually empty exoskeletons left behind after the creature molted, scientists had no idea what its face looked like. It wasn't until recent, groundbreaking CT scans of rare young fossils that we finally saw its true face, and it was really bizarre. While it had the body of a millipede, it possessed the jaws of a centipede and stalked eyes like a crab. These unique eye stalks suggest it may actually have been semi-aquatic. What we know from its fossils is that Arthropleura moved through leaf litter on the forest floor, most likely eating rotting plants and fungi. It went extinct when other competitors surpassed him, and the climate dried out, shrinking its habitat until there was nothing left for it. Jaekelopterus. Imagine walking into a murky river, water up to your knees when something grabs you from below. 2 spiked claws, each roughly the length of a grown man's arm. That's what an encounter with Jaekelopterus, the giant sea scorpion, may have looked like. In Germany, in 2007, they found a single claw, and it was 18 inches long. From that one piece, researchers were able to estimate the size of the full animal, and the number they arrived at was hard to believe. Jaekelopterus was around 8 feet in length, making it the largest arthropod, a category that includes insects, spiders, and crustaceans ever discovered. It lived roughly 390 million years ago in rivers and estuaries, which are the saltier areas where rivers meet the sea. Most scarily, those huge claws were not for defense. It was a predator. Researchers believe it likely waded in shallow, muddy water and ambushed fish and other creatures that came too close. The environment it hunted in would have made it nearly invisible until it was too late. It went extinct due to conditions changing and other predators outcompeting him. Dunkleosteus. Usually to eat, animals have teeth. However, the Dunkleosteus didn't, and what it had in its place is pretty terrifying. Its head was armored with bony plates, which extended into its mouth, forming 2 pairs of sharp-edged blades that worked like scissors. As the animal bit down repeatedly, those blades ground against each other, resharpening with every strike. This is why this creature is referred to as having a guillotine instead of normal teeth. Researchers have estimated its bite force at somewhere between 6,000 and 7,500 newtons at the tip, which would place it among the most powerful bites of any animal ever measured. It also opened its jaws in approximately 1/50th of a second, generating enough suction to pull prey directly into its mouth before they had time to react. It lived roughly 382 million years ago in the shallow seas that covered much of what is now North America and Europe. Adding to how disturbing this creature was, it was also pretty big, between 11 and 13 feet long. Also, we found fossil deposits containing regurgitated remains of other Dunkleosteus. It appears to have eaten its own kind and then brought up the parts it could not digest, so it was also a cannibal. It went extinct during the late Devonian extinction event, one of the 5 major mass extinctions in Earth's history. Titanoboa. In 2009, in an open coal mine in northern Colombia, workers and researchers had been finding weird fragments for a while. A lot of them ended up in boxes. It was not until a snake specialist looked closely at one of the pieces that everything changed. The bone was unmistakably from a snake. It was just far, far too large to make any sense. When they analyzed it, they found that it lived around 58 to 60 million years ago, right after the dinosaurs went extinct, and that it was a constrictor, meaning it killed by wrapping around its prey and squeezing. The same way anacondas and pythons do today. However, the insane part was the sheer size of this creature. It was roughly 42 feet long and weighed over 2,200 pounds. To put that in perspective, the largest anacondas alive today barely reach 26 feet and weigh a fraction of that. Hallucigenia. You might have noticed that the name of this one resembles the word hallucination, and that's not just a coincidence. This name was given by scientists because this is one of the most confusing creatures in paleontology. So much so that when it was first reconstructed in 1977, scientists built it upside down and back to front. It was found in Canada, and it dated back to the Cambrian explosion, about 508 million years ago. The first reconstruction showed it walking on a row of rigid spines, using them as stilts, with a line of soft tentacles waving from its back. The problem was that the reconstruction was completely inverted. The structures identified as legs were actually a row of protective spines running along its back. The tentacles he placed on top were actually its legs, soft and clawed underneath the body. Even after that discovery, though, one mystery remained. There was a dark, rounded blob at one end of many fossils that researchers had long assumed was the head. In 2015, a detailed study finally confirmed that the blob was not a head at all. It was a stain left by fluid that had seeped out of the body during decomposition, preserved in the rock by accident. The real head was on the opposite end. It was small and round, with a simple pair of eyes and a circular mouth. Inside the mouth was a ring of teeth, and running down the throat were additional teeth pointing inward at an angle, designed so that anything entering the mouth could not pull back out. The same 2015 study placed Hallucigenia on the evolutionary branch that eventually led to velvet worms, and by extension to a much larger group that includes all molting animals, meaning insects, spiders, crustaceans, and many others. Megalania. This creature is the closest thing we have to a real-life venomous dragon, and most scarily, it lived recently enough that humans likely saw it. It was a giant monitor lizard that lived in Australia until roughly 40,000 to 50,000 years ago. At that time, woolly mammoths were still alive, and the first humans had already reached Australia. There is a real possibility that the people who arrived on that continent came face to face with this animal. Current estimates put it somewhere between 11.5 and 23 feet long, making it the largest terrestrial lizard known to have ever existed. Even at the lower estimate, it was significantly larger than the largest Komodo dragons alive today. Matter of fact, Megalania was closely related to them, and likely hunted in a similar way. This creature was likely an ambush predator, rushing their prey suddenly, and there's a possibility that they also produced venom, just like Komodo dragons. It hunted the large mammals of prehistoric Australia, including giant wombat-like creatures the size of hippos. When those prey populations declined, possibly due to human hunting pressure and climate shifts, Megalania likely ran out of food and it went extinct. Saccorhytus. This one is disturbing for a different reason. It's probably the nastiest one on the list. They found Saccorhytus in China, in limestone deposits dating back roughly 540 million years to the Cambrian period. The fossils were tiny, about 1 millimeter across, and they had to be extracted from rock under microscopes. What researchers found when they looked closely was a small, wrinkled, bag-shaped creature with an enormous mouth relative to its body. The name reflects this fairly directly. It roughly translates to wrinkled bag. The weird thing about Saccorhytus is that it appeared to have no anus. Researchers suggested at the time that waste was likely expelled back through the mouth. When it was first described in 2017, the team studying it proposed that Saccorhytus was one of the earliest known deuterostomes, which are a major branch of animal life that eventually gave rise to fish, amphibians, reptiles, birds, mammals, and humans. If that classification would have been correct, then it was sitting very close to the base of the family tree that ultimately produced us. However, a new study debunked this theory, considering them a very early, primitive ancestor of arthropods and nematodes, the group that includes insects, crabs, spiders, and roundworms. Tanystropheus. This is one of the creatures with the strangest proportions ever found, so much so that it caused a long-lasting debate between researchers. It was a reptile that lived about 242 million years ago, and fossils have been found across Europe and the Middle East. The animal was roughly 19 feet long in its largest form, but what immediately stands out is that nearly half of that length was its neck, around 10 feet of neck attached to a relatively small body and a short tail. That neck contained only 13 vertebrae, which made it long but also quite stiff. Not the flexible, sweeping structure you might imagine. It could not bend freely in all directions. It pointed mostly forward. For decades, researchers debated how this anatomy was actually used. A rigid neck that long on an animal that size is difficult to explain on land. It would have been unwieldy and hard to lift, but in water, held horizontally just below the surface, it starts to make more sense as a tool for ambushing fish. Then, in 2020, a study using micro-CT scanning, which allows researchers to look inside fossils without physically breaking them open, examined the teeth of different Tanystropheus specimens and found something unexpected. There were two distinct tooth types in the fossil record. Large specimens had simple, fang-like teeth suited for catching fish and squid. Smaller specimens had multi-cusped teeth, the kind better suited for eating shelled animals like shrimp and crabs. What had previously been assumed to be youngins and adults of the same animal turned out to be two separate groups, living completely different lifestyles. If you want to discuss this video or suggest an idea for the next one, join my Discord.